The bottle was so small I almost missed it. It sat tucked into the inner pocket of my husband's gray wool coat, the one he only wore to special occasions, and when I pulled it out, my hands were already shaking before I even read the label. 30 white capsules, no prescription information, no pharmacy name. Just a handwritten number on a strip of masking tape wrapped around the glass. 2-3 inches liquid. Fast acting. I stood in our bedroom closet for a long time without moving. The coat still smelled like his cologne. Outside, I could hear him downstairs in the kitchen, whistling something cheerful while he clattered pans. He'd told me that morning, over coffee, that he wanted to do something special for our anniversary. 30 years, he'd said, squeezing my hand across the table. We should celebrate properly. I put the bottle back exactly where I found it, straightened the coat on its hanger, and walked into the bathroom. I locked the door and sat on the edge of the tub. I sat there for a very long time, trying to understand why I wasn't more surprised. And that's when I remembered the dream. It had come 2 nights before. I'd fallen asleep early, which I almost never do, and somewhere in that deep, heavy darkness, my daughter was standing in the kitchen of the house where she grew up. She was wearing the yellow cardigan she'd had in college, the one with the small moth hole near the left cuff. She looked exactly as she had at 38, the age she was when she died. Her hair was pulled back. She was calm. She looked at me with those steady brown eyes and she said, very clearly, "Mom, don't drink anything he gives you at dinner." I woke up with my heart pounding and the sheets damp with sweat. My daughter, Claire, has been gone for 4 years now. A car accident on an icy road in February, 2 towns over. The police said the other driver ran a red light. They never found him. I had told myself the dream was grief. I had told myself it was my mind processing old pain in new ways. I'd had dreams about Claire before, most of them gentle, most of them just the 2 of us sitting somewhere quiet and talking. This one had felt different. It felt less like memory and more like a message. But I was 65 years old, a retired nurse, a practical woman, and I had pushed it aside by morning. Now I sat on the edge of the bathtub holding the memory of 30 white capsules in my palm, and I understood that I had been wrong to push it aside. I need to tell you about the week before all of this happened, because none of it makes sense without it. My husband Frank and I had been married for 3 decades. He was a retired civil engineer, methodical and quiet, a man who kept his feelings in neat compartments and rarely lost his temper. We had built a good life together. We weren't the kind of couple who finished each other's sentences or danced in the kitchen, but we were steady. Or I had believed we were steady. Frank's younger brother Dennis had been living with us for 11 months by then. He'd moved in after his divorce from a woman named Vivienne, who had packed her things and left without much explanation. Dennis was 59, unemployed, and had what Frank called a rough patch that seemed to have no end in sight. I had agreed to let him stay because Frank had asked me quietly, and I loved my husband, and I trusted him. Dennis was pleasant enough on the surface. He called me by my first name, ate dinner with us most evenings, and laughed easily at things that weren't particularly funny. But there were small things. Things I had cataloged without meaning to, the way nurses catalog things quietly, automatically, filing observations away without deciding yet what they mean. Dennis made phone calls in his car rather than inside the house. When I came into a room where he and Frank were talking, the conversation would shift smoothly to something neutral. Twice in the past 3 months, I'd come downstairs late at night for water and found them at the kitchen table with Frank's laptop open between them, papers spread out, and both of them looking up at me with the same careful expression. The first time I'd thought nothing of it. The second time I'd noticed Frank closing the laptop before I'd taken 3 steps into the room. And then there was the will. 6 weeks before our anniversary, Frank had mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd updated some of our legal documents. Just housekeeping, he'd said. I had nodded and not thought much of it. Frank handled the finances. He always had. I was good at medicine, and at people, and at raising our daughter. And Frank was good at spreadsheets and insurance policies and compound interest. It was a division we'd settled into easily and never questioned. But something in how he said it, the particular flatness of his voice, the way his eyes went briefly somewhere else had sat quietly in the back of my mind like a stone in a shoe. After I found the bottle in his coat, I didn't go downstairs right away. I washed my face. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror for a moment. I was 65 years old. I had gray hair and good posture and the kind of face that people described as kind. I had spent 40 years taking care of other people, my patients, my husband, my daughter, my granddaughter Sophie, who was 8 years old and currently at school across town, and completely unaware that her grandmother was standing in a locked bathroom trying to decide whether the man she'd shared a bed with for 30 years was planning to kill. Is done. The thought, stated plainly like that, felt absurd, and then it didn't. I went downstairs. Frank was making a sauce on the stove. He looked up and smiled when I came in, and it was such a normal smile, such a Tuesday morning smile, that for a moment everything I'd just thought felt impossible. He asked if I wanted coffee. I said yes. He poured me a cup and handed it to me, and I drank it, and we talked about whether it was supposed to rain on Saturday, and the whole time I was watching his hands. Dennis was out. He often disappeared during the day without saying where he was going. Frank said he was probably job hunting, but I'd stopped believing that months ago. I waited until Frank went out to the garage to look for a tablecloth. Then I went to his study. I want to say that I felt guilty going into his space without being invited, because that's what I would have felt 6 months ago. I didn't feel guilty. I felt the same focused steadiness I used to feel in an ER when everything was happening very fast and I needed to think very clearly. His desk was organized. Frank was always organized. I started with the filing cabinet, which he kept unlocked because we'd always trusted each other. The household files, the tax records, the insurance folders, I went through them methodically. It took me 20 minutes to find what I was looking for. It was a document from an attorney's office I didn't recognize, dated 8 weeks ago. Our previous will had been simple, everything to the other spouse, and then split equally between Claire and, after Claire's death, her daughter Sophie, and whatever other children we might have in our lives. This document was different. Under the updated terms, if I died, the entirety of the estate, the house, the retirement accounts, the investments, all of it passed to Frank. That was not unusual. What was unusual was the secondary clause. If Frank died within 18 months of me, or was incapacitated, the estate transferred not to our granddaughter Sophie, but to Dennis. I read it twice. Then I photographed every page with my phone. I put everything back exactly as I'd found it, closed the filing cabinet, and left the study. I went upstairs and sat on the bed and thought about what I knew and what I didn't know. What I knew. There were unidentified sedative capsules hidden in my husband's coat pocket. Our will had been changed, without my knowledge or discussion, to benefit his brother. Our anniversary dinner was tomorrow night. Frank had been acting, now that I cataloged it properly, like a man preparing for something. What I didn't know was how far back this went, and whether any of it connected to Claire. I almost didn't let myself think that last part. It was too large. It was the kind of thought that, if I let it in, would change every memory I had of the last 4 years, of the funeral and the grief and the nights I'd cried while Frank held me and told me it was going to be all right. I pushed it aside and told myself to stay with what I could prove. I called my friend Ruth that afternoon while Frank was still in the garage. Ruth had been my closest friend for over 20 years. She was 71 and sharp as a tack, and she didn't panic. I told her what I'd found. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Margaret, you call your attorney today, and you don't drink anything at that dinner." The second part of what she said landed on top of my daughter's voice from the dream, and I had to close my eyes for a moment. I called our family attorney, a woman named Patricia, who had known us for 15 years. She was in court, but her assistant took a message. Patricia called me back just before 6, and I told her quietly and precisely what I'd found. There was a pause. Then she said, "The document you described was not filed through our office. Frank did not consult me on any changes to your estate documents." Another pause. "Margaret, I need you to listen to me. Do not eat or drink anything at that dinner tomorrow that you have not prepared yourself." After I hung up, I sat with my phone in my lap and listened to my husband calling my name from the bottom of the stairs, asking if I wanted to try the sauce he'd been working on. "I'll be right down," I called back. I didn't go down for another 10 minutes. I used those 10 minutes to do something I should have done weeks ago. I opened the browser on my phone, and I searched the name of the attorney's office on the will document I'd photographed. It was a small firm, Registered 18 months ago. One partner listed. The name meant nothing to me until I searched it in combination with Dennis's name and the city where he'd lived before the divorce. They'd gone to college together. That night, I barely slept. Frank slept easily, the way he always did, which I had always admired and now found I could not stop looking at. In the dark, I lay on my side of the bed and I thought about 30 years. I thought about how a person builds a life next to another person, and how much of that building depends on a foundation you never check because you've always assumed it was solid. I thought about Claire standing in the yellow cardigan in my dream, calm and clear, saying what she'd said. "Don't drink anything he gives you at dinner." In the morning, I texted Patricia and told her I needed to see her. She made time at noon. I drove across town and sat in her office and spread out the photographs on her desk and told her everything, including the bottle in the coat. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I'd always valued about her. "If those capsules are what I think they are based on the description," she said, "combined with alcohol at dinner, the effect would be consistent with a cardiac event in a woman your age." She said it the way I used to deliver difficult diagnoses, not unkind, just clear. It would likely not raise flags in a standard autopsy. I had already reached this conclusion, but hearing it said out loud in a quiet office on a Wednesday afternoon was something different. I pressed my hands flat on the desk to keep them still. Patricia made 2 calls while I was there. One was to a detective she knew, a woman named Sandra who worked out of the county sheriff's department. The second was to a forensic document specialist. She told me to go home and act normally. She told me to let the dinner happen, but with certain preparations in place that she would coordinate with Sandra. She told me that she needed one more thing from me, if I could manage it, the bottle from the coat pocket. I went home. Dennis was in the living room watching television. He looked up and asked me where I'd been. I said I'd had lunch with Ruth. He nodded and looked back at the screen, and I stood for a moment in the doorway watching him and trying to see what I should have seen before. Frank was in the kitchen, finishing preparations for the next evening. He was in a good mood. He'd bought champagne, the good kind, and he set it on the counter and said he'd been saving it for exactly this occasion. He put his arm around me and said he couldn't believe it had been 30 years. I leaned into him for a moment and I felt the specific grief of understanding that this was performance, that it had been performance for some time, and I didn't let any of it show on my face. That evening, while Frank was in the shower, I went back to the closet. The coat was exactly as I'd left it. I took the bottle, put it in a small Ziploc bag from the kitchen, and drove it to Patricia's office, where her assistant was waiting. I was back in 40 minutes. Frank never noticed I'd been gone. I didn't sleep all that night either. Sandra called me at 7 in the morning. She had spoken with Patricia. She had also, she said, run Dennis's name through a few databases as a preliminary step, and there was something I needed to know. Her voice was careful. 4 years ago, in February, a car was reported stolen from a parking garage 2 miles from where my daughter was killed. The car was found 3 days later, abandoned, with front-end damage consistent with a collision. The case had gone cold. The car was registered to a woman named Vivienne Dennis's wife. The call lasted 11 minutes. After I hung up, I sat on the back porch in the cold morning air, and I let myself feel everything I'd been holding back for 3 days. I thought about Claire driving home on that February night, the ice on the roads, the red light she had every right to believe would protect her. I thought about her daughter, Sophie, who was 8 years old and didn't fully understand yet that her mother wasn't coming back, only that she was gone and that nothing felt the same anymore. I thought about the 4 years I'd spent grieving next to a man who might have been there the night it happened. When Frank came out to the porch and said good morning and asked if I wanted eggs, I looked up at him and said, "Yes, please, that would be lovely." Sandra and a colleague arrived at 3 in the afternoon, when Frank had gone to the store for a few last items and Dennis was in his room. They were in and out in 20 minutes. They did not tell me everything they did in those 20 minutes. They told me enough. The dinner was at 7. Frank had set the table beautifully. Candles, the good china, a small arrangement of white flowers in the center. Dennis sat at the corner of the table, which he sometimes did on nicer occasions, and Frank opened the champagne and poured 3 glasses with the particular care of a man who wants to make sure something is done properly. He handed me mine first. He was smiling. He raised his glass and said something about 30 years and about building a life and about being grateful. Dennis raised his glass too. They both looked at me. I looked at my husband of 30 years across the candlelight and I said, clearly, and without any particular emotion in my voice, "I think I'll have water tonight." A very small thing passed across Frank's face. There and gone. He said, "Of course," and went to get water, and while he was in the kitchen, Sandra walked through the front door with 2 sheriff's deputies, and it was over very quickly after that. The capsules in the bottle were confirmed as a high-dose benzodiazepine compound, the kind that dissolved in liquid without changing the taste or color, the kind that, in a sufficient dose in a woman my age with a glass of champagne, would have been extraordinarily difficult to distinguish from natural causes. The will document was fraudulent, drafted by Dennis's college friend at Dennis's request, signed with a version of my name that was close enough to be credible, but that Patricia's forensic specialist identified in under an hour. The stolen car connected to Vivienne, Dennis's wife, came apart further over the following weeks. Vivienne, it turned out, had left Dennis not because the marriage had failed, but because she had found out what he'd done on that February night 4 years ago. She had been afraid to come forward. When Sandra's office contacted her, she came forward. Dennis had been driving. He had run the red light. He had driven away and left my daughter in her car on the ice and never said a word. Frank had known. Not at the time, Vivienne was clear on that, but within a year, Dennis had confessed to him. And Frank, who was steady and methodical, and who kept his feelings in neat compartments, had made a choice. He had chosen his brother. He had held me while I cried at Claire's memorial service, and he had chosen his brother. The investigation took 4 months. I won't tell you it was clean or simple, because it wasn't. There were days when I sat in Patricia's office going through documents and felt nothing at all, a kind of smooth numbness that I recognized from nursing as the mind's way of getting through what has to be gotten through. There were other days when I drove to Sophie's school to pick her up and watched her come through the door with her backpack and her small, serious face, and I felt something so large and complicated that I didn't have a word for it. Frank was charged with conspiracy and with being an accessory after the fact in connection with Claire's death, in addition to the charges related to the fraudulent will and the attempted poisoning. Dennis was charged with vehicular homicide, leaving the scene, and conspiracy. Their trials were separate. I attended both. I sat in the 3rd row each time, and I did not look away. Dennis received 12 years. Frank received 9, with the possibility of additional charges pending. Patricia told me the sentences were consistent with the evidence. I thanked her and drove home alone and made dinner for one, which I was getting better at. Sophie lives with me now. Her father had been out of the picture for years, and I was the family she had. We were learning each other. The 2 of us learning a new rhythm in the house, new routines, the particular way she liked her toast and the particular way I needed the quiet of early morning before the day began. She asked me once, about 3 months after everything came out, whether I missed her grandfather. It was a Thursday evening and we were doing dishes side by side. I thought about it honestly before I answered. "I miss who I thought he was," I said. She considered this with the grave seriousness of an 8-year-old processing something large. Then she said, "I think Grandma Claire knew." I stopped with my hands in the water, and I looked at this small person next to me and I said, very carefully, "What makes you say that?" She shrugged in the way children shrug when they know something they don't have language for yet. "She used to come into my room at night sometimes after the accident," she said simply, not in a scary way, just to check. "I think she was checking on you too." I didn't answer. I finished the dishes and I dried my hands and I kissed the top of my head where her hair parted, that specific warm smell that children have that I've never found a word for. Later, after she was asleep, I sat on the back porch where I'd sat on that cold morning when Sandra called me, and I thought about what it means to trust the things that come to you in the dark. I was a nurse for 40 years. I believe in science and evidence and the reliable logic of cause and effect. I also know, in the way that people who have spent decades watching human beings at the edge of things tend to know, that there is more to how we are connected to each other than any chart or document can hold. My daughter came to me in a dream and told me not to drink what I was given. I almost didn't listen. I'm glad I listened. There is a photograph on the mantel in the living room, Claire at 35, laughing at something just outside the frame, the yellow cardigan, a blur of color at the edge of the shot. Sophie stops in front of it sometimes. She doesn't say anything. She just looks with that steady brown gaze that is so completely her mother's, and then she goes on about her day. I go on about mine. I learn what mornings look like now. I tend the garden that I neglected for years because I was always too busy with everyone else's needs. I call Ruth on Tuesdays and Patricia on the 1st of every month. I drop Sophie at school and I pick her up and I listen to what happened at recess with the particular focused attention I used to reserve for things that seemed more urgent, because I understand now that there is nothing more urgent than this. Sometimes at night, in the specific quiet of the house after Sophie has gone to bed, I find myself just sitting, listening. Not to anything in particular, just listening in the way you listen when you've learned, once and completely, that the important things can come softly, and that the cost of not hearing them is too high. I haven't dreamed of Claire again since that night. I don't know what that means. I think it might mean she said what she came to say, and that she knows I heard her, and that she knows we're all right now, Sophie and I, the two of us in this house that is slowly becoming ours, with the garden growing and the photograph on the mantel and the quiet that is finally, after everything, beginning to feel like peace. If you have someone who comes to you in a dream, in a memory, in that strange space between sleeping and waking and tells you to be careful, please listen to them. I know how easy it is to tell yourself it isn't real. I know how reasonable it feels to set it aside and go downstairs and drink the coffee your husband hands you and talk about whether it's going to rain on Saturday. I know exactly how ordinary the most dangerous mornings look. Trust the voice, even when you can't explain it. Especially then.